Population and consumer demand for more products and services have been growing in Falls Church, Virginia since the late 1600s. Serving the needs for these increases, the businesses of Falls Church have had to change with the times. In the early 1700s, farms were the primary business. The first permanent residents farmed the land to produce food for themselves and for those immediately around them. The only cash they had generally came from tobacco they grew and transported to the tobacco warehouse. Falls Church was an ideal location for early tobacco farms, as the rolling road for tobacco, which connected the Vestal Gap in the mountains down to the port of Alexandria, went right through Falls Church. This road later became known as Route 7 and Leesburg Pike, or in Falls Church, Broad Street. Farmers used horses to pull the barrels called hogsheads from Falls Church to the warehouse to receive their payment. Farms flourished even after tobacco farming died out. Local farmers grew cash crops for the residents and restaurants of Washington, D.C. One of the most popular farms was the Golden Rule Poultry Farm run by Milton Roberts. Many businesses developed in Falls Church to serve the needs of the local farmers. Lynch's Feed Store and Harmon's Blacksmith both served farmers for over 50 years in Falls Church. But the days of farming didn't serve the growing population well in Falls Church starting in the 1930s. Lynch's Feed Store had to close its doors, and by 1957, the blacksmith shop had to close its doors. Falls Church was settled and prospered because it was a crossroads, first of trails, then of rolling roads, then of railroads, and then of highways. And travelers have always needed to have a place to stay and to eat. Starting in the 1700s, a succession of inns, including Big Chimneys Inn, Wren's Tavern, the Star Tavern, and Taylor's Tavern, to mention just a few, were well written about by presidents of the United States and Army generals. Later, many entrepreneurial citizens served the needs of travelers by opening up their houses as guest homes. Later, the tourist cabins and motels served the needs best of travelers coming through Falls Church. While most eating establishments were originally associated with inns or taverns, separate restaurants became more popular in Falls Church by the 1940s and the 1950s. Merchants were rare in Falls Church prior to the Civil War. An 1869 mercantile report records only one Falls Church merchant. As the population exceeded 500, only a few years later, the number of merchants increased quickly. Merchants who put their roots down in Falls Church for many generations included George Mankin, who started Mankin's Pharmacy, George Washington Thomas, who owned a shoe shop at the corner of Broad Street and Washington Street for 57 years, George Irwin, who founded the Falls Church Bakery, and Valinda Lynch Mankin, who founded Mankin's Notions and Dry Goods, and Frederick Foote, who owned another store at the Crossroads and owned all of Seven Corners. Perhaps no one business person has had a more lasting influence on the business of serving our needs in Falls Church than Merton E. Church. A pharmacist by profession, Church moved close to the Crossroads on West Broad Street and founded a real estate office that developed the first subdivisions in Falls Church. He founded the Falls Church Bank and Trust that later became the Falls Church Bank. He founded the first local phone company and the first local electrical company. He saved the local railroad company from bankruptcy. And he organized a company that successfully encouraged and funded a major new highway to come through Falls Church. And he also influenced almost every aspect of commercial development in this growing town. Like most distinguished business leaders of his day, he served as president of the Village Improvement Society. Perhaps his most lasting gift to Falls Church was founding the Greater Falls Church Chamber of Commerce and agreeing to serve as its first president. Merton E. Church added a level of sophistication to the business climate previously unknown in Falls Church. Another early local business that was essential to the commercial development was Brown's Store. In 1883, James Brown founded what was to become Falls Church's most popular general store and later a hardware store. His son, Horace, carried on the business following James's death and became a leader in most of Falls Church's civic and business activities. Those who remember Horace Brown have compared him to George Bailey in It's a Wonderful Life. On the day that Horace Brown died, Falls Church's schools and businesses closed in his honor. His son, Hugh, has carried on the business into its 117th year and is considered a local business icon. Those who have lived in Falls Church for decades cannot even imagine Falls Church without Mr. Brown and Brown's Hardware at our crossroads. Brown's has outsurvived every new twist in business and population growth by continuing to serve the customer's needs in an efficient and courteous manner that makes everyone feel better when they leave his store than when they entered. Perhaps the single greatest reason that the population of Falls Church grew so fast from 1865 to the 1940s was the rail tracks from Washington, D.C. that went right through the town. Businesses appeared like magic next to the rail stations and at all of its stops. Henry Anderson, who developed his successful insurance company near the East Falls Church Station, started his working career as a youngster at the Roslyn Milling Company, milling corn and other farm products to be loaded onto railway cars. While businesses flourished early by East Falls Church Station, later businesses at the West Falls Church Station also developed. West End Shopping Mall is perhaps the last major enterprise to take advantage of its proximity to the rails. The opening of the Metro Rail near the end of the 20th century, which passes along the outskirts of Falls Church, was expected to provide an extra commercial boom in Falls Church. In this case, the businesses have yet to arrive. The early merchants up through the 1940s generally lived in Falls Church and maintained very close civic ties in the community. The needs of the community were served by naming businesses after Falls Church. They also named their businesses after their own name. They stood behind their name and either lived right over the store or just down the street. Dramatic changes began to occur in Falls Church and in the ways that businesses had to respond to a growing local population and changing consumption habits following World War II. Perhaps the one major change in consumption habits that affected Falls Church more than anything else was the increase in the use of automobiles. While automobiles have been widely used in Falls Church since the early part of this century, the businesses of Falls Church jumped in headfirst to serve the post-war boom. Auto dealers and service centers sprung up all along Broad Street and Washington Street. Roads were widened to accommodate the added cars. Trees were torn down and few were replaced in the road and building widening efforts. As the automobile increased its influence on every aspect of life in Falls Church, the needs of the residents also changed, and so therefore did the businesses. Early businesses started in buildings along the main road or railroad, and the business owner generally lived above the store. Today, we call this mixed use. As the population of Falls Church grew, demands for business space grew, and homes along major thoroughfares began being used for businesses. Ultimately, the Victorian homes that lined Broad and Washington Streets were demolished, and strip malls and small standalone stores were built. In other areas, 3 or more story office buildings started going up, serving the needs of businesses that catered to the needs of other businesses or the government. The final curtain to many of Falls Church's locally owned retail businesses was the opening of large malls in Seven Corners and Tyson's Corners. To cope with these changes, large areas of the Crossroads areas were demolished, and Falls Church entered a painful transition period, one from which the community has yet to fully recover. While most of the early businesses of Falls Church are now gone, a new business community continues to serve the needs of local residents. Population growth and increased rates of product and service consumption per capita drive the business community to change with the times. Just as these aerial views of Falls Church from the 1950s through the 1980s show the dramatic changes that occurred in the business district over a 30-year period, we can expect an equally radical change in the business environment to occur over the next 30 years. The rolling roads, the railroads, the automobile, rapid population growth, a strong local economy, and the presence of a few key individuals such as Merton E. Church have been the driving forces in Falls Church's commercial past. What do you think will drive future commercial forces in Falls Church, Virginia?